trying to get onto YouTube as well. Welcome everybody watching on YouTube to the Wednesday class that shall not be named. I think we're going on. Let's see if we're on live on YouTube. It does say yes, we're on YouTube now. All right, fantastic. Welcome everybody to our Wednesday class. We are excited to be here as we're continuing our study of Israeli leaders in history. And we're going to conclude our discussion on Menachem Begin, and then we'll talk a little bit about Moshe Dayan. Welcome to Arlene and Ron and Karen and Stuart and Larry and Jane and Michael and Eva, possibly Paul and Genevieve and everybody watching on YouTube. It's pretty cool because we got pretty close to finishing Menachem Begin, didn't quite get there.
Yeah, question.
Yes, Ron.
If they're on YouTube, how come we don't see them?
If you're on YouTube, you just watch.
Oh.
You can't participate and we don't see you. And it's also impossible to know who's watching. We will get a number, like it'll say 10 people watch on YouTube, but you don't know where they're from or who they are. Also, people watch on YouTube often later on, like they will start it at 3 o'clock today as opposed to doing it now. Welcome, Lou.
Hi, everybody.
Great to see you.
Good morning, Lou.
Oh,
And-
Stuart.
You asked me something? I'm sorry.
Hi, she
No,
said,
I just said good morning. So we're talking about Menachem Begin, and we got to right up to the beginning of the War of Independence. So he's, again, disciple of Jabotinsky. He is, the leader of the Irgun. He has got his, once World War II is over, he immediately starts attacking the British again. Times he's working with the Haganah secretly. At times the Haganah is trying to reel him in. The King David bombing was a big issue. And as we get closer to the War of Independence, we see that there is still a division between the Haganah and the Irgun and the Lehi. And this is a problem for David Ben-Gurion, especially because David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of Haganah, of course, is going to become the first prime minister of Israel, does not want to have multiple armies. He wants everybody to be in one military together. So he cannot come to an agreement with Menachem Begin on this. And so basically they began an argument in many ways over some weapons that were coming into the country on the Altalena, which is the ship that came out of France. And basically, there were a lot of things going on. He said, if we can't have the weapons, then nobody does. And the ship was sunk. And they lost a lot of weapons. And eventually, Begin agrees to serve in the military. And this is the end of the Haganah and really the beginning of the IDF. And so Begin, of course, after confrontations between him and the forces there, Yigal Yadin, who is the chief of staff or the pre-chief of staff, he bombs it, and people died, and it really became an issue. But that's what happened, and they also arrested 200 or so Irgun fighters. They released most of them later, but so it was a way to really bring them together. So by the war's beginning, and one of the reasons they won was because they were one group together, whereas the Arab forces were, of course, not united. You had the Egyptian forces, you had the Syrian forces, the Lebanese forces, the Jordanian forces, and everybody wanted their piece of the pie. But now the Israelis are completely united and organized. And that is one of the main reasons they actually win the wars, because they're united and organized, whereas obviously the rest weren't. So he serves in the war. After the war, he becomes a part of Knesset, and this is a place he will serve. Well, let's actually during the war again. Obviously, served. He starts his revisionist party, and he works with Einstein and others, going across America, trying to drum up support and money. So when the first elections come out, and we got to remember, we talked about how the Mapai, which was the pre-Labor Party, dominated politics in the 50s and 60s, completely dominated them. And the party he was part of actually won over 10% of the vote, which was pretty good for a kind of a revisionist right-wing party. So he would become what we would call the opposition party leader. Now, the opposition party leader we mentioned in America is, we don't use that phraseology, but right now there's a Democrat in the White House. The Senate is the Democrats have more there, and the House Republicans have more there. So some years, usually when a president wins for the first time, as with Biden, and I think Trump as well, the Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency at one time, and then of course the Republicans had it at one time, and then it goes back and forth. We had Biden, before that Trump, before that Obama, before that Bush, of course before that Clinton. So we go back and forth. There's only been one time since Eisenhower in 52 in which one party has won 3 presidential elections in a row. It's only happened once, and that was Reagan and then George Bush Sr. So before that, you had Eisenhower, then you had Kennedy and Johnson, then you had Nixon, then you had Carter for just 4 years, and then it goes back and forth. So we have to understand that Israel was a true democracy, but from 49 till 77, it was totally dominated by one party. And even in the later 70s, when the now Labor Party was losing some steam, they were still winning by a lot. That was until 1977. So he would be the opposition party leader for almost 30 straight years. 30 years. Did not get along with Ben-Gurion most of the time. Some of the times he got along with better the others. At times he was considered a radical, so he couldn't represent Israel because some countries wouldn't let him in, especially Britain, because they considered him a terrorist. He was the radical voice, and you need to have multiple voices. It would have been much more problematic if Israel had had a complete domination by one party, winning 95% of the vote, because that means it would not have been a legitimate democracy. Nobody wins 95%. At their height, during Golda Meir's first term, I think, they won 56. I think we talked about 56 seats out of 120. So at the very height, Labor won, 47%, 46%. So that's a good sign for democracy, that one party is not dominating, but it did dominate in terms of working with other parties for a very long time. And during this time, the animosity between Begin and Ben-Gurion got higher and higher at times. Sometimes it lessened, but let's just say Ben-Gurion was not always restrained in what he said publicly about Begin. And I don't think Begin was ever restrained about anybody at all. So now what we see is what happens to change things. And during this time period, what's going on? Well, you have, of course, the reparations from Germany, which Begin was very against. It's like we should not be taking money from these people. We have the immigration. We have the 6-Day War. And during the 6-Day War, Begin's party, which had changed names, serves in the national unity government. And that really becomes a tradition. This is what happened recently. When Israel went to war with Hamas, Bibi Netanyahu brings in people from the other parties for the national unity government for war. And that's always been the tradition. So during those times, he would do it. Now, by the 70s, the Labor Party was completely in control. And that would change. So remember the 6-Day War. We won. Everything went really smoothly. But after the 6-Day War, after other plans for ceasefires, Begin becomes more radical again. And we all know what leads to his becoming something different than he was. And that is the Yom Kippur War. So the Yom Kippur War is a devastating defeat, even though Israel wins the war and ends up going all the way to basically goes right up to Egypt, goes all the way into Egypt, goes all the way into Syria. But it's considered a major loss because they almost lost. And Begin now starts working with other opposition parties, really working with Jewish refugees from other countries who've moved in, working with the religious parties. After Yitzhak Rabin becomes prime minister after Golda Meir, of course, there's infighting with labor. Rabin is actually kind of forced to leave for some financial issues. It wasn't what we would call major ones for us, but it had to do, I think, with bank accounts in other countries. I think they had a bank account in America. There's some simple things that were very illegal in Israel. And so what happens is in May of 1977, not only do they win by a pretty steep margin. And this is, of course, the turning point. So since 1977, the parties have gone back and forth until very recently with Benjamin Netanyahu, whose party controlled the Knesset for most of the last 20 years. But for the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, they would go back and forth. But Begin, whose party is basically known as Upheaval, the party he starts, is now prime minister, which is shocking to anybody outside the country because he is this radical and has been this whole time. He's a conservative, but he's also not a radical in all the ways you would think. He is a radical when it comes to the economy. He wants to really bring capitalism and mix it with the socialist economy. And he is one of the ones who's credited with changing the way Israel does business. One of the reasons Israel is such a dynamic economy today is because he wanted to change it. And he, and of course, worked with Ariel Sharon. The Labor Party got only 32 seats, which was down 19 seats. Likud got 43 and was able to create a government Not only that, Moshe Dayan had been on the outs. He brings in Moshe Dayan from the other party to be part of his party to give some popularity and so some cohesion. And now, even though Likud wins in a landslide in terms of they defeat Labor by a lot, they still have a very narrow majority. Because it's not about Likud winning a lot of, it's about how much of a majority he can get. He gets exactly 61, which is the lowest it ever been. It is the lowest you can have to run Israel. Likud had way more than that every time. Likud almost had 60, Labor almost had 61 by itself. So it was a very narrow one, even though they really beat Labor by a lot. The parties, which included the NRA, which is the National Religious Party. And so there's a narrow majority. And what he does is he changes a lot of things. So we're not going to go to Camp David yet, but he changes programs for how you support the elderly, how you minimum everything from driver's license to long-term care, changing the exchange rate, how they worked with other countries. So in other words, he is the first one to talk about how, and I don't know how this works because I'm not an economist, the shekel will be connected to the market as opposed to the value being determined by the government. And that was one of his major changes. And there was a lot of other ways it's funny to call him a liberal, but when it came to the economy, he was very liberal. And so, and I'm not sure how he did it all, but the government got more involved in inflation and just basically economy-wise, that did much better. He helped, especially with inflation, although by the end of his, it would be, but he, worked with this idea of a free market economy. Any of you understand how this works, but that's pretty much what he did. When it comes to the poverty, he tried to lower the net amount of poverty in the country, and some of times it backfired, so we had some problems there. But overall, he did some really good things very early on as prime minister. But of course, what is he known for? He's known for one thing and one thing only, and that is, peace with Egypt. So this is the big moment in his career. And it's ironic that he did so well early on with finances because he had to leave. He stepped down a few years and later on because of the financial issues. But he and Moshe Dayan and Ezra Weitzman started to negotiate with Anwar Sadat. Now, this is to us today a normal thing. Israel's been at peace with Egypt since 1978. Sometimes it's a strong peace, sometimes it's not very strong in terms of how they get along, but the peace has always held. It has never not held in almost 50 years. So that is pretty impressive for peace. Of course, Egypt is the enemy going all the way back to, we know, ancient times. Egypt was the leader of the Arab world at this time. Today would be probably Saudi Arabia, or on the other side, Iran. And they started secret negotiations probably before even Begin was there. And even eventually got Anwar Sadat to come to Israel. They went to Camp David, of course, and Jimmy Carter, and his greatest moment in his presidency was basically negotiating with these guys, at many points telling them what to do. If you haven't been to the Carter Center in Atlanta, it's wonderful. There's two things. There's the Carter Museum, And then they have the Carter Center, which is like a peace center. So whether you like him or not, what he did with the Accords is really fantastic. He did a great job. And we know there were some issues with his viewpoint on Israel later on, but he brokered this peace treaty, which again was very controversial within Likud party because they were radical, this was what they've been fighting against. So the idea that the Likud party would give back land for peace was very strange and very controversial within his party. Less so, ironically, less so in the opposing party, the opposition party. So they negotiated this. And again, why was it so controversial? You don't give back land. That was Israel's official policy. Number two, they had to go into the Sinai and forcibly eject all Israelis out of the Sinai. People had moved there. I don't know how many people. I think it was like 200,000 people were there, 250,000. It was a significant number of people. So they had to send the army in to push these people out. Again, they were given money, but again, it's like in America, what is that called? Public domain. They're going to build a freeway and they just force you to move your house. We're going to give you this money, and you go, but that's not what you want. When they built the stadium in Dallas for the Dallas Cowboys, they did that to some of the people, and they paid them well, but some people don't want to leave their homes. Stuart, did you want to add something?
I was just going to say it's called eminent domain.
Eminent domain. Thank you. Thank you very much. I should know these things, and I just forget them sometimes. So this led to a not insignificant split within the Likud party. Now, part of it was over the peace. Part of it was the moving of settlements. And again, we've had no issues in the Israeli area with settlements since 1978. And that is sarcasm, by the way, just in case you wondered. There's been no issues with settlements in Sinai because Israelis have been going. Not as many Israelis went to Egypt during the tenuous times, but a lot of Israelis would go to Sinai. But obviously, what we know is the settlements in the Sinai, and when Israel took out the settlements from Gaza, are nothing compared to the settlements in the West Bank. We have to understand that. If you are a religious, Orthodox, nationalist person living in the West Bank, it is not the same as the people who lived in the Sinai or Gaza. Why? Because the Sinai and Gaza are not really talked about very much in the Bible as being part of Israel. The Gaza was for a short time, but there's nothing really significant that happened there biblically, except for the Philistines. Sinai was not part of Israel biblically. However, the West Bank is. And not only that, there is a holy city in the West Bank, that is Hebron, one of the few holy cities in the Jewish world. So that is a much bigger issue if Israel has to go in and remove all of the settlements there. So that's a whole different issue. So they create this peace that's here today, and it was controversial in his own party, but he did it. And as we know, as controversial it was for Menachem Begin, it was 1,000 million, 100 million times more controversial for Anwar Sadat, who had to have known there were going to be many people who would try to assassinate him when he did it. Obviously, he was assassinated, I think, just 2 years or 3 years later. But really, probably the bravest man within all of these moments, whether you liked him or not, to make this decision to bring Egypt into the modern world, to line Egypt with America as opposed to Soviet Union. Now, obviously, Egypt ended up getting a lot of money for this from the U.S. Israel got nothing, but of course, the peace treaty, which was more valuable than money. Since that time, there's been no skirmishes between Israel and Egypt, really. The loss of life has been none, except for some accidental stuff here and there. So really, Egypt got what they wanted, and Israel got even more. Even though Egypt got this giant landmass and oil and billions of dollars every year from America. Nobody on Israel's side can say they didn't get something important. They got a legal peace treaty with their biggest enemy. So what else is he known for? Obviously, the second thing, and lesser known, but still probably known, is the bombing of the Iraqi nuclear reactor. So I think that is pretty well known. That was still during his time period before he stepped down. Obviously, it was Saddam Hussein who was really revving up his anti-Israel rhetoric and creating, this creating the bomb program. Mossad found out about it, and in 1981, Begin has it destroyed. And to this day, it's known as the Begin Doctrine. So any country that gets weapons of mass destruction that threatens Israel, Israel is going to go after them. They also, so that is, now, what are the controversial moments? It's really funny. You would think there'd be more controversial. The Iraqi attack was controversial, but again, even Israelis who were against it understood it. That was something that needed to be done. The Lebanon invasion was really a really good and bad moment for them, because they authorized them to go into Lebanon to assist the Maronite Christian leadership who were under attack by the Muslims. Now remember, Israel was actually invited into Lebanon. Ironically, it was, I believe, I think David Ben-Gurion who even discussed doing the same thing in the 50s, going into Lebanon and pushing up the Maronites to make sure they could stay in charge, and Israel would make peace with Lebanon through that, which in hindsight may have actually been a good idea. So they didn't realize how much of an issue was going to be. As we know, the war itself is the easiest part, just like the Iraqi war. What's hard is what comes afterwards. Israel went in, basically goes to Beirut, really, have very little forces stopping them. They basically forced the PLO into Tunisia, which really doesn't matter because, the PLO is becoming a terrorist organization. Anytime a terrorist organization goes to war in an actual war, they're going to lose, because unless they become an army, because again, you don't need to be a terrorist organization if you have the stronger army. If you have the stronger army, then but what really, again, what comes out is the Sabra and Shatila massacre, and I think many of us heard about this. This was the low point in his career. Of course, his defense minister was Ariel Sharon, who bore even more of a brunt of responsibility. It was not the Israelis who massacred these two villages. It was the Israelis who allowed the Christian armada to go in and do it. So Israel did not protect them as they were supposed to do. So it became a massive issue in Israel and outside Israel. There were tens and maybe hundreds of thousands of people protesting when they figured out that these villages had been slaughtered and that Israel had not stopped it before it happened, and which they could have apparently. And so this was really probably the more famous one, but the economy's faltering also is really what lasted and what created his decision to resign. And, as with many of these politicians through all those years, he was plagued by depression and all the pressure, and he was not a young man. He'd been through the battles. So this really ended his career. He stepped down. It ended Ariel Sharon's career, because we know no Israeli politician can ever make a comeback in Israel. which is again irony and sarcasm because it happens all the time. Yitzhak Rabin would become prime minister in the 90s after his Ariel Sharon, whose controversy was much bigger than Rabin's, although he had never been prime minister, he will actually become prime minister later on. I think it was George Bush Jr. who would, I think they were, they joked a little bit together about how, making comebacks was called impossible because both were, George W. Bush, nobody ever thought he would become president after he had a lot of controversial things happen, and nobody ever thought Ariel Sharon would ever be prime minister, even though he was the heir apparent before this, probably. So he retires, and Yitzhak Shamir takes over. Ironically, Yitzhak Shamir had been the head of Lehi, which is a probably even more radical group that had broken off from, they still maintained good relations with the Irgun, but they broke off and probably were even a little bit more radical in the 40s. And so Begin, retires, steps down in 1983, really just becomes a hermit afterwards. The Depression, all of the things that, had been, his wife, I think, died pretty recently after that. And he didn't give interviews. He didn't talk to anybody. He just became basically a hermit. He gave like 1 or 2 interviews right before he died. He wouldn't die for he died in 1991. He gave 1 interview, and that was on the anniversary of Jabotinsky's death, but really became a hermit and really just went into his own shell, which is ironic because he had been such a vibrant, radical, wonderful leader, and helped really form Likud. And obviously now, since he took over, Likud has probably been in power a majority of the time since he first took over. And so his legacy continues. He died in 1992, not 1991, and really has a lasting impact. Some consider him a terrorist, like in Britain, some a hero. He had 30 years of being the opposition party leader, which must have been really grating and difficult because it wasn't like he had 40%. We're talking he had 10% in, maybe 10 to 20% maybe in his party but he just remained there ever in the minds of Ben-Gurion and Eshkol and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, making sure they stayed honest and did what they needed to do, and always giving him the other opinion, which is essential in Israel. And, he founded Herut, which is the actual name of the party before it became the Likud. So any questions or thoughts on Begin? I think all of you lived during his time as prime minister. I was, very young, so it was not well known, but what was he thought of in America when he was prime minister before Egypt and the Camp David Accords and after the Camp David Accords? Was he, I don't know if he was popular here.
I think the Camp David Accords was kind of like Nixon going to China. And I don't think that, that he was particularly popular among most American Jews. I mean, if you think about it as Labor being the more progressive party, and, most Jews go to the left politically here. So he wasn't, I don't think he was ever very popular. I don't know, Ron may disagree, but
you guys would know more. I mean, I know of him as prime minister at the time, but the Camp David Accords are probably like the very beginning of my memory of Israel.
And he was very different too. But Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, who were the faces, they were pretty secular people. Whereas Begin did not hide the fact that he was Shomer Shabbat and much more traditionally religious than his predecessors, and I think that made a little difference also in the way people perceived him.
And he really changed politics in a lot of ways with the religious party, helping them to understand that they could have a say if they gathered their strength. And as we know, the religious parties are basically, in many respects, running Israel right now. And so that had a lot to do with him reaching out to them and saying, you need to vote and you need to join in coalitions. Also helping the Orthodox serve in the military. He was very supportive of that. The ultra-Orthodox obviously don't, but the modern Orthodox do. So we'll finish off with him. But again, the legacy is going to always be Camp David Accords. I mean, Shatila and those are stains on his career, as is the economy. And ironically, even though he was much more conservative in what we call politically, he was much more liberal economically than the liberals, who were much more socialistic. And obviously, the socialism was essential for Israel in the 50s and 60s as they're trying to get everybody to have be part of it. But, to compete on the world economic stage as a small little country, they needed to really liberalize and combine a kind of socialist with a market economy, kind of what like China's doing on a bigger level. So Israel, of course, went a little bit farther one way. So we'll talk now about the last one we're going to talk about. And obviously, famous, but never was prime minister. But we also have talking about other people who were prime minister. We talked about Jabotinsky and Herzl and Weizmann and Trumpeldor, those are the really famous ones. So Moshe Dayan would be obviously another very famous Israeli leader. If it hadn't been for the Yom Kippur War, probably would have become prime minister. He served under both Likud and Labor. And he is unique in a very important way. In many ways, he is one of the first great Israeli leaders who was actually born in Israel. So obviously in Israel, there is no law saying you have to be born in the country to be prime minister, because that would have been impossible for most of them, because almost all of them were born in Eastern Europe. And so he was the first prime minister who I believed was born in Israel, because I don't think Levi Eshkol or Moshe Sharett were either. So he was born in what was then, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire. And he was born, not only that, but he was born in, of all places, Kibbutz Dagania, one of the famous kibbutzes, one of the early kibbutzes. And that was very unique. His parents, obviously, for Eastern Europe, we would think so. He was not religious at all. Very maybe anti-religious, but much more of probably an atheist. But he was not religious. He lived on Moshav later on in life. So he was, a socialist labor movement, work the land kind of guy growing up. And, he's born in 1915, but so by the 30s, when things are really starting to heat up in Israel, he's right in the middle of it, excuse me. He's in the Haganah before he's 15. I mean, basically, and that was not unusual. The young boys were doing that all over the place as soon as they could, stand upright, because that's what they need. But we also have to remember that the Haganah was working with the British a lot in the late 30s to help maintain order, even though the British was very anti-Jews. And he was one of the people who worked with the British, and at times working with them, at times working against them. So he's kind of doing a little bit of both. And I think a lot of people were doing that, and so he works with the Britich. He eventually is found that he was working with the Haganah. He's arrested, gets out of prison when World War II starts. And of course, he then works with the Haganah in the Palmach during World War II. He's staying in the area, but he's helping to attack places in the Middle East on behalf of the British military. Now, what's he also most famous for? Obviously, the eye patch. The eye patch. Now, I don't know if it's bad. Luckily, it was not scratched out by a cat or something like that. It was actually a sniper shot, didn't hit his eye, hit, I believe, the binoculars or something he was holding, and that went into the eye. And that's why he lost his eye. This was during World War II. So he was working with the British and lost his eyes. For some reason, he could not wear, he had some problems with glasses or something. And so that's why he had the eye patch. Now, what's amazing is that he was still allowed to serve in the military, because he really went to his British superiors and said, I want to still serve. Kind of like what Trumpeldor did in Russia without an arm. I guess without an arm or without a eye. And so he continued to serve. And I think it was, but he would be depressed and have problems with it emotionally throughout his life. He became iconic for him, but it still was, very difficult for him. Because before he became super famous in the late 60s, to have this eye patch walking around, he wasn't as famous, and certainly growing up. But he still maintained his military career. He served World War II and then was part of the Haganah during the Revolutionary War. Now, he was not always successful. And that is one of the interesting things about him, that during war he had some successes and some failures, but he was really supported by Ben-Gurion. And at times he was thought to be not the person for certain jobs, but Ben-Gurion and others put him there. He was the person who helped protect and take Jerusalem, or half of Jerusalem, during the Independence War. One of the people who was, I believe, came up with the idea of the road, like the Israeli-Burma Road. And so for those of you who don't know what that was, Israel, there was one road into Jerusalem, and Ben-Gurion really wanted to keep Jerusalem. There was a fort guarding that road, and it was impregnable. Dayan and others had tried to get into Latrun, and they couldn't do it. And so as the date for a ceasefire was coming into play, the Israelis knew that they were going to lose Jerusalem, because what would happen is the powers that be would come in, there'd be a ceasefire, and then the Muslims would be able to rearm themselves, and of course the Jews would not. And eventually the Jewish soldiers would be escorted out for their safety. And so what they did is they dug that secret road almost to the last minute. Nicky Marcus obviously was the famous one also involved with it. At the last second, when they came in and said the Jews need to leave because you can't rearm yourself, they said, well, we have a road. And they showed them the road, and that could go into Jerusalem, and they were able to rearm themselves, and they ended up keeping half of Jerusalem. So he served in various capacities during the war, and including part of the Haganah leadership. He served in offensive. Some were successful, some were not. So again, he was well thought of, but he was not what you would call the superhero during the war. But he was well thought of and really supported by Ben-Gurion, and became a major general. He was demoted, then promoted again, kind of the same thing that happens with all these people, depending on who you get along with. He replaced Yigal Allon, who was very popular. That was also one of the reasons he was not as popular in the beginning. And so he serves, and then after the war, he, of course, goes into politics. Now, he will become part of the initial leadership not the initial, but the early leadership of the Labor Party. So after the war, he becomes part of the Labor Party leadership. They're not known as the Labor Party yet. It's Mapai. And when Ben-Gurion was going to retire, the person he chose to be defense minister did not get along with somebody else. Not the defense minister, but who's ever the head of the military. I forgot the name of the position. But he was appointed to it because the guy who was supposed to be in that position did not get along with the defense minister. So basically, he was not the first choice by any stretch of the imagination, but he started, and what he did in the 50s was really revolutionary. He helped create the modern Israel army. That's what he's going to be most famous for. Working with intelligence, organization, combat units, creating, I think he started the first academy, new ways to mobilize. So he helped modernize the army in the 50s and 60s. And that's one of the things he is best remembered for, is modernizing the Israeli army, so that by the 56 war with Sinai, they're already stronger. And of course, by 67, they're much stronger than any of their enemies. And also, when Ben-Gurion came back after the controversy with Moshe Sharett, he stayed with Ben-Gurion and would become part of the Ben-Gurion cabinet for a long time. And again, he negotiated, very importantly, the purchase of weapons. That was something Israel was struggling with. They'd be able to purchase post-World War II weapons in the 40s, but most countries didn't support Israel. They didn't have a lot of allies. And so what they needed to do in the 50s was buy new weapons and new technologies. And they had to convince countries like America. America supported Israel officially, the first country to recognize Israel as a country, but they would not sell Israel weapons. Either with places like France or England. And he was able to negotiate these treaties and these weapons contracts so he could buy tanks, airplanes, the basic stuff that you need for all of the army. And then, of course, he would then become defense minister next time Ben-Gurion ran, and he would continue to do all this. So he was very much a proponent of retaliation. One of the policies of the Israeli government is, if you attack us, you come over the border and you attack us, we're going to attack you tenfold. Whether you support it or not, if you attack us, we're going to attack the village where you come from. And we're going to bulldoze the village, no matter where it is, even if it's on the other side of the Sinai. And so this is what he was famous for. He was also famous for the Sinai War, which he led when France and England, and he had been getting negotiations with France and England for weapons. France and England did not want Egypt to nationalize the Suez Canal, so they worked with Israel. Israel would go in, take the Suez. Egypt would come in, save the day, and say, Israel, you need to go back, and then stay in control of the Suez Canal. And Dayan was the architect of that, of course. It was secretly done, and he wasn't supposed to do it, but he was. And as he's doing it, of course, America comes in and says, no, you can't do that. You need to go back home. So America was the one who stopped him, but it did not derail his political career at all, because obviously it was more of a feather in his cap. He was Minister of Agriculture for a while. And so he was really very prominent. And of course, he was in the government for the Six-Day War. He was not the man who planned the Six-Day War, as some people think. He was the guy who took back Jerusalem, but others, I think, were the ones who actually planned it. And so he, of course, becomes very famous after that. He gets a lot of kudos, not just because of the Six-Day War, because he didn't plan it, but because Israel's army is now what? It's a world power. It was considered decent, able to hold up against a neighboring country, but nobody thought Israel was as a power. They did have the nuclear, they did have the bomb, and then they go in and just swipe these countries like they're butter, completely annihilating everyone who, it was a desolation. In 6 days, they destroyed the entire Egyptian Air Force, destroyed Jordan, Lebanon. It was a complete rout in only 6 days. And so they end up, of course, with the West Bank, with the Sinai, with the Golan Heights. And even though he hadn't really been in the planning stages, it was his military that he had prepared that really won it. And so, of course, he is very popular. And when Eshkol dies, Golda Meir, of course, keeps him on as defense minister. There's no way she couldn't. He was really popular, and together those two were the ones who won the biggest landslide victory in Israeli history. And of course, his rise is complete until obviously the Yom Kippur War. Now, he had already had this policy. Israel, after the 6-Day War, they continued the war of attrition where Egyptian forces would come across the lines, but anytime the Egyptians came over, his policy of going over in tenfold, if you attack us, we're going to make sure you know what you're going to pay the price. And that continued. But of course, after the war, the Yom Kippur War, he became very unpopular. He was, fairly or not, the man considered most responsible for it, as he was defense minister. Was it his fault entirely? No. Obviously, there were others, but he is the one who decided not to mobilize the military, thinking that there was no way they were going to attack. He also thought they were going to lose. In the middle of the Yom Kippur War, he felt like we're going to have to retreat to different areas and give up part of our land during this war. But of course, he's Israeli. So what happens? What does it mean if you're an Israeli politician? No matter how hard you fall, guess what? There's comebacks. Bibi Netanyahu came back. Ben Gurion came back. Yitzhak Rabin came back. Ariel Sharon came back. They always come back. The only way not to come back as an Israeli politician is if you die and you still have a 50% chance of coming back. That is it. It's hard to believe that Netanyahu is still prime minister. We haven't had really a young Turk who's been prime minister for any length of times. It's always been the old guard for the most part. So how does he come back? Well, of all things, a few years later, Menachem Begin makes him his foreign minister. So he'd gotten some of his popularity, still all the support, but he switches parties. He agrees. And remember, what does Menachem Begin need to do? He needs to get 61 Knesset people. He's 40-something in his party. He needs 61. So he needs somebody who's going to give some connection and some assurances. And so he takes Dayan, and of course, Moshe Dayan is he doesn't win the Nobel Peace Prize, obviously, but he is part of the process and a major part of the process. Obviously, having someone who is labor, who has been very hard standing against Egypt, like Begin, but from the other side, helped the negotiations. And of course, he helps in this process, which is great. Obviously, he has a falling out with Begin because the only other thing that's assured in Israel with politicians coming back is that they're going to have a falling out with each other. Everybody has a falling out with each other. He has a falling out with Begin. Begin obviously is a little bit more centered on keeping the territories and doing and setting up settlements, and Dayan is not as supportive of that. So he steps down and dies a few years later. So he really had a lengthy career. You know, at the very end, he starts his own party that does win the basic amount of, you have to get enough votes to get 2 seats or 3 seats in Knesset, and he gets just enough votes to get back in Knesset. So he would have been back in Knesset in the 1981 elections with 2 seats, but he suffered a heart attack. I think he had cancer and he died from a heart attack. And so obviously today, though, he is very popular. He is considered a hero, as is Golda Meir, as is Begin, as in Ben Gurion, despite their failings. And this is kind of the club of great Israeli heroes, the top level. You know, the A level, you've got Chaim Weizmann and Theodor Herzl, Joseph Trumpeldor, and of course Jabotinsky, Moshe Dayan, Menachem Begin, Golda Meir, and of course the top level is David Ben Gurion. They have successes, they have failings, they have fallouts with each other, they make comebacks. All of them came back from something, as long as you were living. And so it's an interesting thing that and some of them, their children stayed in politics. You know, Begin's son becomes a Knesset member. So Ariel Sharon, I mean, a lot of these people stay in politics the rest of their lives.
Makes me think of the motto that I heard about all the Jewish holidays summed up in one sentence. They tried to kill us, we survived, now let's eat.
Yeah, and that's basically how the Israeli, now we'll see what happens. Obviously, Netanyahu in many ways mimicked what Rabin tried to do in modernizing the economy, because in the 90s he modernized it even more. And so there's a lot of connection between these. I mean, these people are deceased, but Netanyahu knew a lot of them. I mean, he grew up, Israel's a small place, so Netanyahu is growing up with these people and knowing them and speaking with them. I mean, he was in politics, you know, at the same time as Shamir almost, and Shimon Peres. And so it's one degree of separation. So those are the kind of the heroes that created Israel through the early 80s. Any questions or thoughts about? All right, I answered all of them. Now the question is, do we want to do more Israeli stuff, or should we go back and do something else with some other bios? And let's go what we talked about doing.
I have to tell you, last week and this week is very excellent.
Well, we could do more Israelis. We could do the 1980s, stuff like that.
Shimon Peres. Have we talked about Shimon Peres?
We have not. We have not. So let me just type all this in. We talked about Rob Cook. We did talk about Rob Cook. We could talk about Ahad Ha'am. We could talk about Shimon Peres. We could talk about Yitzhak Rabin. So whatever you guys, if you want to stay on the Israeli thing, we can do that, or we can go somewhere else.
There's a name that's eluding me at the moment. He was around Ben Gurion's time, was really an archaeologist, but became
Yadin.
Yadin.
Yeah, we could.
No, maybe.
Yeah, we can talk about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he's the most famous Israeli archaeologist, and he was also a very prominent military person. You got Yadin. So he was deputy prime minister. He was the man who, I believe, created the idea that Israel should have 1 or 2 major digs and a lot of minor ones. Obviously, he is the one who did Masada. Yeah, which I think some people here may have worked with. A lot of people through the years met him because he was one of the people who got a lot of American volunteers to go there and do it. So they got to meet him during that dig and some others.
No.
Oh, sorry. Are there any prominent ones out of Portugal and Spain, out of the Sephardic region?
There are not as many as we would say who prime minister, but certainly very much so. And since the 70s and 80s, there has been a very strong Sephardic, election prominence there, and so definitely that. So we could do. I mean, again, we can do any of these things or all of them. It's what you want me to do next week.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Two comments. One is, yesterday, obviously, they had the Michigan primary, and I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, and apparently what has become more of a rift between Netanyahu and Biden over something that maybe Biden doesn't even have that much control over, but is Netanyahu's reticence over.
Well, we could talk. I think we could definitely bring that in next time for sure. And again, of course, things will change. But yeah, what we saw in Michigan is a little alarming that there was so much anti-Biden from the Democrats because of his policy in Israel. That's Michael. But
I reject that totally.
Good. I've not seen it. I've not looked it up yet. I'm just hearing the.
If you look at the vote total, yes, the total number of votes for
right, they did not. They still voted for him, which
were great, but the percentage is well within a standard deviation of previous primaries where incumbents or leading candidates. There were still, the same 10, 12, 15% who voted for uncommitted.
Okay, good.
And I think the press, I think the press is doing a, for me,
they're trying to drum it up, but I have not read about it yet. But again, I don't like the why should this one little thing be such an important thing for the elections? I mean, it's a small little country, but again, we'll see what happens. But I think it sounds like people want to continue with Israel next year. Do you want to do post-Begin?
The other thing I was going to mention, Rabbi, was that I know you have a committee. I just saw another email that came out about what we could do to support Israel. Has anything come out of that that's worth discussing?
Oh yeah, well they haven't come up yet.
There are, despite what Michael Schwartz said, and I agree with him with some respect with the numbers, but I think it goes far greater than that because now the numbers include not only the Arab Americans, they're including some of the younger people, they're including there are hints now that things are really getting there worse, and there's a bigger rift between Biden and Netanyahu than ever before. But I'm wondering whether or not we've come up with any kind of ideas that have come out of the committee that
they're going to start. Yeah, we just had a talk on Israel on Saturday to make sure. And then we're going to, it's other people in the committee. There's different thoughts as to sistering with cities there, volunteering, money. There's a lot of different things they're thinking, but they haven't figured out exactly what they're going to do. But I'll keep it. As soon as I know, you guys will know. You probably know before me.
The discussion on Saturday was so good. You missed a good one, Larry and Jane. Really, it was excellent.
So so next week we'll do post-Begin Israeli leaders. Let's get more into the modern world. Talk about some that are not as well known. Also, this Friday night, anybody interested? I'll be doing a talk on the greatest Jewish entertainers, and that is a dinner talk. And then Saturday we have Rabbi Jack Romberg, who's going to speak on, I think, the German immigration to America.
Right.
So we usually have one program a month on Saturday, but because we did the Israel thing, we ended up with 2 in a row. But he's really March, and that one we had 2 in April because we had the guest. We packed everything a little bit on. It just ended up how it was done.
But it's been great.
It's been great. So we'll be doing that this weekend.
Yeah.
And we just started a program. We're on Tuesday nights. We're working with Lutheran Ascension to feed the homeless. We're probably doing it once a month. Who knows if we'll do more later. So we just started that as well. Also, of course, Women of Israel have Mahjong, I think, next week. And we're going to be, the church next to us will be using our building on Wednesdays for their discussions. So it'll be kind of nice that a lot going on. So looking forward to it.
Stuart did his Kabbalah class last night.
That's right. And
Good.
that's right. It was last week.
Was good.
Kabbalah
last
class
night.
Last night.
Yeah.
That's right.
It's
Tuesday.
every other week.
Today is
Last
Wednesday,
week.
right? Yeah, we have an announcement
There's a lot
every
going
week.
on.
Yeah. And then we got Purim, and those of you who want to act, I haven't got the Purim spiel from the guy
yeah.
yet. So as soon as
Okay.
that happens, I'll let you know.
Okay.
And set up a practice. Hopefully it'll be soon, very soon. But
So much going on.
Yeah,
It's
because we
great.
also have the Purim. If anybody would like to come for the Purim Masquerade, it is a fundraiser. It's our other fundraiser of the year. And then the next morning we'll be with the conservative synagogue during Sunday school because it's actually Purim, reading the entire Megillah. And then later in that morning we'll have the Purim spiel.
I had a question for you about the masquerade. What kind of costumes is it a full costume thing? What kind of costumes do people use for it?
It is not a full costume thing. It is a mask. It is wear a nice outfit with a mask. Think of like the balls in Venice.
Okay.
You have this mask or you have that. It's not you can dress up as costume, but you don't have to. And I'll be coming in I'll probably be in a tux and in a really cool mask, maybe a top hat. And there'll be a promo explaining all this coming out this week. We did a promo on what to do. But yeah, it's great because again, we don't do very many fundraisers that are big. This is the only big money fundraiser we're doing. We do it, once every once in a while we do it. So we'll see how it works. I think it's great. We have Jamie and Marlene
Richmond, right.
are doing it, and this is all them. It's a great idea, and it's going to be a big, massive thing. It's going to be really cool, and anything that they work on is awesome. So, and the only problem is they don't want me wearing one of my awesome costumes, so I can't get an awesome. I'm going to be wearing the mask, but I think it'll be kind of cool because I've never been to one of those things where you wear like this kind of mask. So I'm still debating if I'm going to have one of these or the ones that you tie on. I don't know yet. We'll see.
You don't want to be Batman?
I would love to be Batman.
He would love to do Star Wars, is what he'd love to do.
Stars. Yeah, I've got those outfits already.
Maybe they'll allow you to wear a cape and a cowl without the rest of the.
That is an excellent idea. I think I'm going to do that.
See, you really need an advisor.
Yes, I do, and because I already have the cape. Obviously, I have.
There you go, cape and cowl. That's pretty
cape,
close.
I have a cowl, the cape and the top hat. That's what I'm going to do. Good, thank you. That's perfect. All right, I'm all set. I don't know whether you guys are set or not, but I am.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Bye.
you so much. This was
All
good.
right, so
This was really
post Began next
excellent.
week, and we will see you everybody next week on the Wednesday class that shall not be named. Stay safe, everybody.
Sounds